Well, looks like I won't be needing these. I hate YouTube sponsorships. Yup, that's the video. Okay, fine, I'll talk about it more.
What do you have?
Let me tell you about this video's sponsor.
What did you say?
ExpressVPN.
Huh?
I heard his order, Mr. Krabs. He said he wants...
ExpressVPN takes the data you send over the internet and wraps it in a protective bubble to keep it away from prying eyes. Then it sends that data through a secure tunnel to its destination. It's all part of the virtual private network that allows you to
for 20% off.
Please, make it stop.
I've grown tired of the increasing trend of sponsor segments in YouTube videos as of late. Some vary in quality and care, where you can tell it was phoned in as opposed to when the product is an actual thing that the creator uses. Some literally interrupt in the middle of videos out of nowhere, making it pretty clear the sponsor segment was shoehorned in at the last second. And some... well, you know what? I've made a tiered list for this, using letter grades. So before we begin, let's take a look at that so we can go through this properly. This will be ranked into 5 tiers. A. No sponsorships. B. No sponsorships but with support or Patreon segments. C. Sponsorships but rarely, not intrusive, and or only for things the creator actually uses. D. Sponsorships that the creator pretty clearly doesn't seem to even use. F. Sponsorships for the sake of sponsorships that are also intrusive. Please note that not everything will fit in nicely into each category. For example, a sponsorship could be in D tier despite them being highly intrusive, but it is leveled out because the creator actually uses it, or a Patreon segment could be in tier C or D because while they're not doing a sponsorship spot, the segments are rather intrusive and obnoxious. The tiers are there as guidelines more than anything else. I'll also add a bit of an additional note where there is sort of a sponsorship, but it's for something made by the person themselves. These usually manifest themselves as merchandise plugs, and we'll get into what I think of those later. For now, let's stick to the tiers mentioned. Also, one last thing before we continue. This isn't supposed to be against people who put sponsor segments in their videos. I get why they do it, usually to make some extra money, sometimes a lot more from what I've heard. I'm still personally not a fan, but I get why, so don't take this as anything against people who opt to do sponsor segments. Tier A is really simple. The creator doesn't do sponsorships at all. Now, depending on what your metric is, this could be the vast majority of people, or it could be a gradually shrinking amount of people. To start with the inevitable, technically correct portion, it's correct to say that technically most people aren't doing sponsorships here. But that's also because most people aren't going to interrupt their 20-second cat video to plug a raid or something. But from a practical standpoint, more and more YouTubers, especially those who get above a certain amount of views or subscribers, are starting to fall into categories that aren't this. They'll put something in their video, which is where we move on to Tier B. This is the home of those who don't do sponsorships, but they will plug some sort of donations, usually for Patreon or that YouTube members thing. Now, I don't think there's anything wrong with either of those, except maybe if it's pushed a bit too much. Oh, and I'm sorry, but don't forget to like and subscribe, hit the bell button, and be sure to comment has gotten quite annoying. So maybe avoid that too. Not anything horrible, but it is a bit irksome. Oh, and this is where merch comes in, right? I mean, I could understand that, but not exactly. First of all, I think merchandise is plugged a bit too much as a common thing, especially by certain people, to a point where it goes a bit beyond donate if you want. But we'll get to the merch thing in a bit. Now, you could consider me tier A or tier B, depending on how you look at it. I did plug my Patreon a couple times, but that was about it. I don't demand donations from people if they don't want to, and honestly I think if they really wanted to, they would know how to do so. The same goes for the whole like and subscribe thing. I don't think I need to really remind you to do that. Well, let's move on to the next tier. In tier C, we have the start of real sponsorships, but they're rare, not intrusive, and or they're only for things the creator uses often. Now this tier is arguably the one with the most leeway, maybe second only to D tier. Yeah, it's very easy to tell what A or B tier is, or what F tier looks like, but C and D tier cover quite a lot of things. While I still personally don't like sponsor segments, these tiers are where I'm the most okay with them. Generally, the person is advertising something they actually use, not sponsoring for the sake of, I want/need a sponsor segment for this video. And look, if you want to accept a sponsorship from something you actually used more than once before reading off the sponsor spot, then by all means go ahead. Or hey, even if it is something you only used once, at least don't make it intrusive, and actually structure it well. There's one other exception I'll give for this tier. If your sponsor segment is creative and well done, then yeah, I'll give it a pass. Sadly, that isn't the case for quite a few sponsorships. Tier D is where, sadly, I'd say somewhere north of half of sponsorship segments that I've seen end up going. As in, you can pretty clearly tell this was done for the sole purpose of they wanted or needed money. They used the product a couple times for the sake of getting B-roll or to say they did, and that's about it. This is also where the asterisk portions of sponsor segments arrive. What's an asterisk portion? Allow me to demonstrate. Oh, I use this all the time, asterisk, when I have nothing else on hand. This product is great, asterisk. From the one time I used it, then never used it again. The other issue is some of these sponsor segments can also be very formulaic. What do I mean by formulaic? Hey, Mr. Rolf, better known as the Angry Video Game Nerd, why don't you tell us about your latest sponsor?
But first, I want to tell you about today's sponsor.
ExpressVPN.
I get it!
Again, I get the reason for this, and I'm not knocking people for doing this because they need to pay the bills, but I am saying this is where it lands. One of the things separating this from Tier F, however, is that usually you can tell there was an attempt made to make it flow okay enough into the video proper, instead of appearing out of literally nowhere, and as a whole, it wasn't intrusive. The same can't be said for Tier F. Tier F is home of the absolute garbage. This has all the negatives of the previous tiers, plus one key difference. Sponsor segments are intrusive and annoying. These are the ones I hate the most. For crying out loud, I've seen videos where the person is talking, music and all, and immediately cuts to, this video is sponsored by, insert sponsor here, and then it jumps back to how it was before. You could very clearly tell that this was a last-minute addition, so much so that I wouldn't be surprised if they either didn't have the segment in there at all, or during editing they had a slide that said, shove in sponsor segment here. I'm not going to be giving examples of this practice, but it's just bad. But oh, there's even worse. Some people will dedicate entire videos to just a sponsor segment. And I don't mean the whole video is a sponsorship in a creative way like Max G did, where the sponsor was a joke, mostly, and it was a plot device instead of an actual sponsor. I mean, hey look, we sold out for a game that we've literally never played and basically did the entire video in one take. Also, yeah, that's literally the entire video. Mind you, I've only seen this maybe once or twice ever, so I don't think it's enough to dedicate an entire different tier to, but just know that sort of thing does exist. Remember how I said, by the way, that I don't really knock people for doing sponsor segments? Well, if you somehow wound up in this tier, congratulations! You're probably the exception to that. It's one thing to include a sponsor segment, it's another thing entirely to make them intrusive, obnoxious, or downright shoehorned in. Plays on sponsorships. Now there are some videos which deliberately play with the idea of sponsorships. I actually kinda love these, and I have 3 examples to briefly show you here. Tom Scott's Fake Out VPN ad. This video was a sponsor segment that Tom Scott was going to do for a certain VPN, but he ultimately decided not to, instead explaining the faults in the advertising of the VPN. He even mentioned at the end of the video how he left
That was a lot of money left on the table. A lot of money.
Though there may be some that argue that this is undermined by a later video he did where he had a robot version of himself say the sponsor segment, though honestly, at the same time, I think that makes it even better. A nice additional play on the sponsor segment bit with the only way to have him willingly agree to that sponsorship was to have a robot do it. That's pretty funny if you ask me. A lot of respect goes to Tom Scott for this, honestly. Max G advertises Raid Shadow Legends. This one is probably the most recent example I've seen of the play on a sponsorship bit. And honestly, it'd probably be my favorite if not for one issue, which I'll get to in a minute. The whole joke is that throughout the whole video, Max, or as some call him, Creep, or even Mr. Gallardi, is trying to do a video where it is incredibly obvious that it is supposed to be sponsored by Raid Shadow Legends. However, the video continually gets derailed, with the Creep continually panicking each and every time. There's far more to the episode than that, including another couple messages besides just Raid is a bad sponsor to get from this, and frankly, I think given how much effort went into the video, as well as every episode of Brain Dump for that matter, that you should just check it out for yourself. My one minor gripe is that there is an actual sponsor at the end of the video. Luckily, Max's sponsors aren't ever that long or intrusive, but honestly, I think for this one, he should have just left it out, since it's the strange contrast from fake-out scummy sponsor throughout the entire video to suddenly actual legitimate sponsor at the very end. But hey, maybe that's just me. Civi's riffs on sponsor segments. This one is a lot more simple than the previous two, but honestly, I just like Civi's riffs on sponsor segments, as well as modern YouTube as a whole. They're relatively short, but they're nice jokes to have in there. So what about merch? I don't think there's one real spot to place merch in the pre-existing tier list, so they're all being put into the C tier as a general rule. They're sort of like sponsorships at times, but also like support and donation things. So maybe you would prefer to call this a C+ or a B-. Mind you, I don't think focusing entire videos around it is a good idea. I don't think they're terrible, but I think I've only ever seen that done well maybe once ever. Mind you, I'd take everything I say about this entire subject with a massive grain of salt, since I've never really been a huge fan of YouTube merchandise as a concept. Why would I wear a shirt with a YouTuber on it when I could wear a regular shirt? And depending on what YouTuber we're talking about, this becomes
A one-way ticket to pain!
Now, some try to force the subject more than others, but I think as it stands, it's been a while since I've seen a particularly bad example of merchandise plugs, even if that doesn't account for the actual quality of the merch itself. Okay, except the line is tech tips. Seriously, okay, we get it. Ha ha ha, lgtstore.com, ha, we get it already. Now, you might have noticed throughout this whole video, I've been going on about sponsor segments rather than the sponsors themselves. And you're right, because with maybe a couple exceptions, Raid, I don't have the knowledge to really delve into that. I think Raid has been the only really bad example I've heard of, and okay, side note here, does anyone actually play that game? I mean, clearly someone must, because there's sponsor segments for it and everything. But I don't think I've ever heard someone going, hey, let's go play Raid Shadow Legends, ever. Sure, there are other flaws with other sponsors. I think the next big example has to be how VPN companies like to stretch the truth a bit about their products. The only other things I can think of are foundations which offer grants to channels for specific videos, which can sometimes be rather questionable, mainly because the segments announcing such will gladly gloss over information like whether or not the people they got the grant from have any biases, where their sources come from, etc. Oh, whoops! Hey, the sources just so happen to come from the same foundation that sponsored us! Whoa, isn't that crazy? Oh, and also the people who sponsored us just so happen to have a vested interest in some of the stuff we're talking about, because they might have investments in some of these things. Wow, what a crazy coincidence, right? Or worse, they're tacked on at the very end of the video and gloss over that information. And finally, there's obviously the scam sponsorships, which, okay, yeah, those ones are just bad, and they're usually trying to get access to your account. How fun! Now before we go, I'd just like to mention a browser add-on that is really helpful. Ironically enough, this is probably going to sound like a sponsorship segment, even though I'm not sponsored by them. It's called Sponsor Block, and using user submissions, it will auto-skip sponsor segments in videos. Ironically enough, this can sometimes make videos flow better than when the sponsor portion was left intact. This actually works really well, and I think the only times it has failed to do its job has been on videos that have just been posted. So I'd seriously recommend that you check it out. So to conclude, do I understand the point of sponsor segments? Absolutely. Do I think some, even quite a few of them, need improvements in some way or another? Also yes. Do I like the idea of sponsor segments on YouTube? Well, no, not really. It's increasingly felt like with these sponsorships and such that it's some of the old ways of doing things, such as on TV, are trying to work their way back in. It also makes YouTubers feel a bit less personal. Maybe that's just the way I view it though. I just think it's difficult to feel as if they're the same, just like you, and I'm just another YouTuber, and anyone could do this if they tried hard enough type of person when 2 minutes before they were reading off an advertising script. Now then, will I ever do sponsorship segments on my channel?
No.
Well, that's all for now. Thank y'all for watching, and take care.
Oh, you want to play a good game? Well, go to your buddy Wario. I know a good game. Raid Shadow Legends.